The Bishop's Apron, Somerset Maugham, Part 3, 7. A week later, Canon Spratter lunched with Mrs. Fitzherbert to meet Sir John Durant and his daughter. The eminent brewer was a stout gentleman of 50, rubicund and good-humoured, with a gold watch chain spread widely over his capacious paunch. The few hairs that remained to him were arranged at judicious intervals over a shining pate. His face was broad and merry, his little eyes were bright with hilarity, and when anything diverted him, he laughed all over his body. He was not tall, and his legs were disproportionately short, so that the slim, elegant canon towered over him in a way that gratified the one without mortifying the other. Sir John's appearance betokened great prosperity and a thorough satisfaction with the world at large. He knew that he made the best beer in England, and the British people knew it too, so he had good reason to be pleased with the state of things. He was a businessman from top to toe, shrewd, blunt, and outspoken, and he had no idea that there was anything disgraceful in his connection with trade. When they sat down to luncheon, and the butler asked if he would drink hock or claret, the brewer turned to him and in a loud, brusque voice inquired whether there was no beer. "I always drink it to show I have confidence," he explained to the company in general. "It makes me fat, but I shouldn't be worth my salt if I hesitated at a few more pounds of voix du pois at the call of duty. I've told the British public on 50,000 hoardings to drink Durant's half-crown family ale, and the British public do. The least they can expect of me is to follow their example." The canon was somewhat taken aback by the frankness with which Sir John referred to the source of his large income, but he was a man of tact, and with a laugh insisted on trying that foaming beverage. "What do you think of it?" asked the brewer, when Canon Spratter at one draught had emptied his glass. "Capital, capital. I'll send you some tomorrow. It's good stuff, my dear Canon, as pure as mother's milk, and it wouldn't hurt a child. I've no patience with those brewers who are ashamed of the beer they make. Why, do you know, Lord Carbis won't have it in his house, and when I stayed with him I had to drink wine. The old fool doesn't know that people only laugh at him. However many airs he puts on, he'll never make them forget that he owes his title to stout and bitter. As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind who knows that I started as a van boy. If I've built up the biggest connection in the trade, it's to my own brains I owe it." Mrs. Fitzherbert laughed to herself when she saw the expression with which the canon received this statement. His idea had been that Sir John belonged to the aristocracy of beerdom, with 2 or even 3 generations of gentlemen behind him who had prepared themselves for the manufacture of fermented liquors by a career at Eton and at Oxford. It was fortunate that his cursory inspection of the brewer's daughter had been satisfactory. She was quite pretty, with a complexion whose robust colouring suggested the best of health, and her brown hair, rather abundant and waving naturally, grew low on the forehead in a way that Canon Spratter thought singularly attractive. He knew something about feminine costume. There were few subjects of which the canon was entirely ignorant, and he observed with satisfaction that she was clothed with taste and fashion. He had no patience with the women who dressed in a mode they thought artistic, and he abhorred the garb which is termed rational. In a moment of expansion, he had once told his daughter there were 2 things a woman should avoid like the 7 deadly sins. She should never take her hair down and never wear a short skirt. "A woman, like a cat, should always end in a tail," said he. Lastly, the canon noticed that Gwendolen Durant's handsome figure suggested that heirs would not be wanting to a union between herself and his son. This somewhat astonished him, for he would never have expected Lionel to set his affections on such a charming but buxom young person. He could not, for the life of him, imagine why she should care for Lionel. "She's worth 6 of him, any day," he muttered, "though I'm his father and shouldn't think it." But there was no accounting for taste, and if a strapping girl, with a dowry of £150,000, chose to make an alliance with his family, he was willing to overlook a parent who would not let an indulgent world forget his indecent connection with honest labour. Canon Spratter had that peculiar charm of manner which led people, after 10 minutes' conversation, to feel they had known him all their lives. And freeing himself from the dowager who had hitherto absorbed his attention, he turned to Miss Durant. He laid himself out to fascinate her, and they made great friends in the hour they sat side by side. When the remaining guests had gone their ways, the canon asked Mrs. Fitzherbert if he might stay a little longer. "Of course," she said. "Sit down and make yourself comfortable. You may smoke a cigarette." The day was warm, and the sun shone brightly. Pale blinds kept out the brilliancy and delicately softened the light in Mrs. Fitzherbert's drawing-room. It looked singularly restful to Canon Spratter, with its gay chintzes and masses of summer flowers. It formed a fit and elegant frame for Mrs. Fitzherbert, who looked handsomer than ever in an exquisite gown, all flounces and furbelows. Its airy grace filled him with content, and he thought that feminine society was really very delightful. The world was a good place when you could sit in a pleasant drawing-room, away from the bustle of ecclesiastical labours on a summer afternoon, and talk to an old friend who was also a fascinating woman. Yet at home there was much to make him irritable. For one thing, he expected hourly a communication from the Prime Minister offering the vacant see, and every time the bell of the street door rang loudly, his heart leaped to his mouth. Almost unconsciously, he assumed an attitude of dignified indifference, such as Cincinnatus at his plough might have used when the officers of the Republic came towards him. But Lord Stonehenge, dilatory as ever, hesitated to make an appointment. Winnie was an even greater source of annoyance. She made no sign of yielding to his wishes. She went out at all hours and none knew whither. She seemed to flaunt her legal independence in her father's indignant face. At home she was silent, frightened and sullen. Canon Spratter pointedly ignored her. He had the useful, humiliating art of looking at people without seeing them, and was able to stare at his daughter blankly as though the space she occupied were empty. He told Mrs. Fitzherbert now the misfortune that had befallen his house, and it was a bitter confession that he had been too quick in his calculations. Mrs. Fitzherbert could not conceal a smile. "It's really very romantic, you know. It reminds me of that poem of dear Lord Tennyson's." "Dear Lord Tennyson hadn't a marriageable daughter," retorted the canon, with some asperity. "Love is so rare in this world," she hazarded. "When two young things are fond of one another, don't you think it's best to let them marry, whatever the disadvantages?" "My dear lady, the man isn't even a gentleman." "But we have it dinned into our ears that kind hearts are more than coronets." "Yes, but we know very well that they're nothing of the sort," he retorted with a laugh. "Heaven knows I'm not in the least mercenary, but I don't think any man can make my daughter happy on a penny less than 2,000 a year. It's not love in a cottage, it's not love in a palace, it's just matrimony in Onslow Gardens." He meditated for a moment or two and slapped his knee. "I promise you that Winnie shall break her foolish engagement with this ridiculous counter-jumper. And what's more, she shall marry Wroxham. People must get up early in the morning if they want to get the better of Theodore Spratter." "Well, you'll need some very skillful diplomacy to achieve all that," smiled Mrs. Fitzherbert. "The worst of it is that though I rack my brains, I can't think of any scheme that seems to promise the least measure of success." Mrs. Fitzherbert looked at him, and her common sense suggested to her certain obvious facts. She smiled again. "Has Winnie seen the young man's relations yet?" she asked. "I think not. Sophia tells me she's going down to Peckham tomorrow." "Didn't you say that Mr. Railing's mother was the widow of a coal heaver? I wonder what she's like." "His sister teaches in a board school." "She must be an exemplary young person," answered Mrs. Fitzherbert. "Well, they must be awful. I wonder if Winnie has thought of that." "By Jove!" cried the canon. The expression was not very clerical, but in his excitement he forgot the propriety of which he was usually careful. His mind was excessively alert, and Mrs. Fitzherbert's reflections, spoken almost at haphazard, gave him in a flash the plan of action he wanted. In such a manner, though with vastly less rapidity, Sir Isaac Newton is said to have discovered the theory of gravitation. The canon's scheme was so bold that it surprised him. When he turned it over and saw how dangerous it was, how unexpected above all, how ingeniously dramatic, he could not restrain his enthusiasm. The subtlety caught his sense of humor, and at the same time flattered his love for power. Apparently he would withdraw from the struggle, but all the time the various actors would work his will. It was well worth the risk, and he felt certain of ultimate victory. He laughed aloud and, jumping up, seized Mrs. Fitzherbert's hands. "What a wonderful woman you are! You've saved the whole situation." He looked at her with flaming eyes, and as she smiled upon him, he had never found her handsomer. He still held her hands. "You know, you grow better looking each year you grow older. Upon my soul, it's not fair to the rest of us." "Don't be so foolish," she laughed, trying to withdraw from his grasp. "Why shouldn't I hold them?" he cried gaily. "We're old friends. Heaven knows how many years it is since first we met." "That's just it. Heaven does know we're both of us perilously nearly 50, and really ought to have learned how to behave by now." "Nonsense. I won't believe a word of it. Everyone knows that there is nothing so untruthful as Anno Domini, and I'm convinced that neither of us is a day more than 30. You don't look it, and I'm sure I don't feel it." "You really must not press my hand so hard. I tell you it's ridiculous." She positively blushed, and the canon's blue eyes were brighter than ever, as he noticed this sign of confusion. "Do you remember how once we walked together in Kensington Gardens? We didn't think ourselves ridiculous then." It was a tactless thing to say, but perhaps Theodore did not remember the exact circumstances so well as Mrs. Fitzherbert. She tightened her lips as she recalled that last scene, and there was no doubt now that she wanted him to leave her hands. "You're hurting me," she said. "My rings." "Oh, I'm so sorry." He looked at her face. "But what have I said to annoy you?" "Nothing," she replied, with a smile, recovering herself quickly. "But my carriage has been waiting for an hour, and I really must go out." "Fool that I am! Why didn't you send me away before?" He bent down and gallantly kissed her fingers. It is a gesture which does not come very easily to an Englishman, but Theodore Spratter carried it off with peculiar grace, and afterwards was able to leave the room without awkwardness. He was not the man to omit any of the courtesies due to the fair sex, and turned his steps immediately to a fashionable florist's, where he ordered a large bunch of red roses to be sent at once to Mrs. Fitzherbert. "Red roses," he wrote on his card, "because they are lovely, ephemeral, and sweet-smelling." On the way home, Canon Spratter meditated upon the bold, decisive step which alone seemed capable of bringing about the ends he had in view. It was easy enough to prevent Winnie from marrying Bertram Railing. Her infatuation would pass away as soon as she realized all that it entailed. But this was not enough. He knew that women may be often taken on the rebound. Perhaps his opinion of the sex was none too high, and if he could excite a repulsion from Railing, he fancied it would lead her into the open arms of the eligible Wroxham. The canon's classical knowledge was somewhat rusty, but he believed vaguely there was a quotation which offered apt authority for the circumstances. He could not for the moment recall it. "Dear me," he said, rather testily, as he put the latchkey into his front door, "my memory is certainly failing, and ironically, it's quite time they made me a bishop." The canon wished to lose no time, and consequently was much pleased to find Winnie and Lady Sophia sitting by themselves in the drawing-room. It would have been inhuman to expect him to play the neat little scene without the presence of his sister. The thought of her astonishment was almost a sufficient motive for his audacious step. "You're very pale, my dear child," he said to Winnie. "I hope you're not unwell?" "No, father," she answered without a smile. "Then what is troubling you, my love? You're not yourself." None could put into his manner such affectionate solicitude as Canon Spratter, and his voice gained such tender accents as to draw confidences from the most unwilling. Winnie sighed, but made no reply. He stroked her hair and pressed her hand. "Come, come, my darling, you mustn't be unhappy. Nothing shall stand between you and my great affection. The only wish I have is for your welfare. Tell me frankly, is your heart still set on marrying this young man?" Winnie looked up gravely and nodded. "Well, well, I'm not a hard father." He smiled good-naturedly and opened his arms. "What would you say if I offered to withdraw my opposition?" Winnie, astonished, scarcely believing her ears, sprang to her feet. "Papa? Do you mean that?" She flung her arms round his neck and burst into tears. The canon, pressing her to his bosom, kissed her fair hair. But Lady Sophia was dumbfounded. "Now, my dear, go to your room and wash those tears away," said he with laughing tenderness. "You mustn't have red eyes, or people will think I'm a perfect tyrant. But mind," he shook his finger playfully as she smiled through her tears, "mind you don't put too much powder on your nose." When Winnie was gone, Canon Spratt turned to his sister with a hearty laugh. "The dear girl, our children, Sophia, are often a sore trial to us, but we must take the rough with the smooth. At times, also, they give us a great deal of self-satisfaction." "Did my ears deceive me?" asked Lady Sophia. "Or did you in fact consent to Winnie's preposterous engagement?" "You're surprised, Sophia? You don't know me. You can't understand that I should sacrifice my most cherished ideas to gratify the whim of a silly schoolgirl. You're a clever woman, Sophia, but you're not quite so clever as your humble servant." Lady Sophia, trying to discover what was in his mind, leaned back in her armchair and looked at him with keen and meditative eyes. She did not for one moment suppose that he had honestly surrendered to Winnie's obstinacy. It was her impression that Theodore was never more dangerous than when he appeared to be defeated. "I don't understand," she confessed. "I should have thought it was a match after your own heart," he answered with a mocking smile. "You have always affected to look down upon our family. Surely you ought to be pleased that the descendant of your ancestral greengrocer should marry the near connection of a coal-heaver. They pair like chalk and cheese." "Don't talk nonsense, Theodore." "I wonder if she calls him Bertie," murmured the canon thoughtfully. "I wish to goodness you wouldn't be so irritating," said Lady Sophia sharply. "Do you really intend Winnie to marry him?" "Of course not, my dear. I intend Winnie to marry young Wroxham." "And do you think the best way to bring that about is to let her be engaged to somebody else?" "My dear Sophia, have you ever known me make a mistake yet?" "Frequently, though I'm bound to say I've never known you acknowledge it." Canon Spratter laughed heartily. "It comes to the same thing. Like the typical Englishman, I never know when I'm beaten." "Good heavens, what a man it is!" she cried. "One can't even remark that it's a fine day without your extracting a compliment from it. Master Theodore, self-praise is no recommendation." "Miss Sophia, your nose wants blowing," he retorted promptly. "That I think is rather vulgar, Theodore." Canon Spratter laughed again. "That's just like a woman. She hits you when you're not looking, and when you defend yourself, she cries, 'Foul play!'" "Fiddlesticks!" There was a pause, during which Lady Sophia, knowing how anxious the canon was to tell her about Winnie, waited for him to speak, while he, equally aware of her curiosity, determined to utter no word till she gave him the satisfaction of asking. The lady lost patience first. "Why, then, did you consent to Winnie's engagement with the coal-heaver?" she asked abruptly. "Because I thought it the only way to induce her to marry Wroxham." "Upon my word, Theodore, you're a very extraordinary man." "That, my dear, is a fact which has not entirely escaped my observation," retorted Canon Spratter, rubbing his hands. "I've brought you to your knees, Sophia. Confess that this time your intelligence is at fault." "Nothing of the sort." "Well, well, I flatter myself," he began. "You frequently do," interrupted his sister. "I flatter myself that I know my daughter's character. Now I am convinced that if I had put my foot down, Winnie would have gone off and married the man there and then. But I know the Spratter character inside and out. We are a family of marked idiosyncrasies." "Inherited from the Montmorencys, I suppose," suggested Lady Sophia ironically. "I have no doubt. You will remember in our father the firmness and decision of which I speak." "I remember that he was as obstinate as a pig." "My dear, I do not want to rebuke you, but I really must ask you not to make these unseemly remarks. If you are incapable of recognizing the respect due to your father, I would have you recollect that he was also Lord Chancellor of England." "Do you ever give me the chance to forget it?" murmured Lady Sophia. "But what has that to do with Winnie?" "I was about to observe that whatever my faults, when I make up my mind that a thing is right, no power on earth can prevent me from doing it. Now, I do not wish to be offensive, but I cannot help perceiving that the firmness, which, if I may say it without vanity, is so marked a characteristic in me, is apt in other members of our family to degenerate into something which the uncharitable may well call obstinacy." "Upon my word, Theodore, it's fortunate you told me you had no wish to be offensive." "Please don't interrupt," pursued the canon with a wave of the hand. "Now, I am dealing with Winnie as the Irishman deals with the pig he is taking to market. He pulls the way he doesn't want to go, and the pig, quite happily, goes the other." "I wish you'd say plainly what you're driving at." "My dear, when Winnie said she would marry Mr. Railing, she didn't reckon on Mr. Railing's mamma, and she didn't reckon on Mr. Railing's sister, who teaches in the board school. In such cases, the man has often educated himself into something that passes muster, and your sex has no great skill in discerning a gentleman from the spurious article. But the women, my dear Sophia, I tell you, Winnie won't like them at all. The more repulsive his relations are, the more her pride will force Winnie to keep her promise. We shall see." Lady Sophia, pursing her lips, thought over the wily device which the canon had complacently unfolded. Then she glanced at him sharply. "Are you quite sure it's honest, Theodore?" "My dear Sophia, what do you mean?" cried he, much astonished. "Isn't it a little underhand?" Canon Spratter drew himself up and looked at his sister with some sternness. "My dear, I do not wish to remind you that I am a clergyman, though occasionally you seem strangely oblivious of the fact. But I should like to point out to you that it's unlikely, to say the least of it, that a man of my position in the church should do anything dishonest or underhand." Lady Sophia, raising her eyebrows, smiled thinly. "My dear brother, if as vicar of St. Gregory's and canon of Tercanbury and prospective Bishop of Barchester, you assure me that you are acting like a Christian and a gentleman, of course I haven't the temerity to say anything further." "You may set your mind at rest," he answered, with a little laugh of scorn. "You can be quite sure that whatever I do is right." 8. 2 days after this, Lady Sophia was sitting alone in the drawing-room when Mrs. Fitzherbert was shown in. At her heels walked Lord Spratter. "I found him on a chair in the park, and I brought him here to keep him out of mischief," she said, shaking hands with Lady Sophia. "I've reached an age when I can only get into mischief with an infinite deal of trouble," answered Lord Spratter, "and when I've succeeded, I find the game was hardly worth the candle." "I've not seen you since Theodore turned you out of the house." Somewhat unceremoniously, laughed Lady Sophia. "I hope you bear no malice." "Not in the least. Theodore's cook is far too good." They both talked very frankly before Mrs. Fitzherbert, whom they liked equally, but the canon would not perhaps have been much pleased if he knew how thoroughly they discussed him in her presence. Lord Spratt asked whether there was any news of the bishopric. "Nothing has been heard yet, but Theodore is convinced he'll get it," replied Lady Sophia. "He'll be quite unbearable if he does." "Quite," she agreed. "I shall shave my head and go into a convent." "You laugh at the canon and you tease him, but he's a clever man for all that," said Mrs. Fitzherbert. "Of course he's rather vain and grandiloquent, but not very much more than most men. I have an idea that he'll make a first-rate bishop." "Theodore?" Lady Sophia considered the matter for a moment. "It really hadn't occurred to me, but I dare say you're right," she said. "Of course he's not a saint, but one doesn't want bishops to be too pious. Curates may be saintly, and it's very proper that they should, but it's equally proper of their betters to leave them hidden away in obscure parishes where their peculiarities cannot be a stumbling block to the faithful. The religion of a man who belongs to the Church of England is closely connected with consols, and he looks with grave distrust on the parson who tells him seriously to lay up treasure in heaven." "A bishop must be a man who can wear his gaiters with dignity," smiled Mrs. Fitzherbert. "But has Theodore the legs?" "If not, he can pad," replied Lady Sophia. "Most of them do, and those that don't certainly should. A bishop must evidently be a man who can wear lawn sleeves without feeling dressed up. He's a prince of the church, and he should carry himself becomingly. I don't know if you've noticed it, but few of them can help purring with gratification when they hear themselves addressed by obsequious clergy as my lord. Theodore at least will carry his honours with a dash. We may be parvenus." "We certainly are, Sophia," cried Lord Spratt. "But Theodore is clever enough to forget it. He honestly feels that his ancestors fought in coats of mail at Agincourt and Cressy." "Heaven save me from the candid criticism of relations," exclaimed Mrs. Fitzherbert. "They're like a bad looking-glass which gives you an atrocious squint and a crooked nose." "We shall have to eat the dust, Sophia," muttered Lord Spratter. "The whole diocese will have to eat the dust," she answered, smiling. "Theodore will stand no nonsense from his clergy. They'll have to do as he tells them, or there'll be ructions. Theodore is not soft-handed, and he'll get his own way by hook or by crook. You'll see, in 5 years it'll be the best-managed bishopric in England, and an invitation to dinner at the palace will be considered by everyone a sufficient reward for the labours of Hercules." Mrs. Fitzherbert laughed, and at that moment the subject of the conversation appeared. He greeted Mrs. Fitzherbert with extreme cordiality, but to his brother, not forgetful of the terms upon which they had parted, he held out a very frigid hand. "I must congratulate you on Winnie's engagement," said Lord Spratter. Canon Spratt looked at him coolly and passed his handsome hand through his hair. "I'm sorry to see that your levity grows more marked every day, Thomas. It seems that increasing years bring you no sense of your responsibilities. I used to hope that your flippancy was due chiefly to the exuberance of youth." "It shows what a charming character I have to stand being ragged by my younger brother," murmured Lord Spratter calmly. He turned to Mrs. Fitzherbert. "I hate far more the relations who think it their duty to say unpleasant things to your very face. You forget that it's my name as well as yours that you drag through the dust." "The name of Spratter?" "It was held by the late Lord Chancellor of England," retorted the canon icily. "Oh, Theodore, don't bring him in again. I'm just about sick of him. It's been the curse of my life to be the son of an eminent man. After all, it was a beastly job that they stuck him on that silly woolsack." "Have you never heard the saying, de mortuis nil nisi bonum?" "That means, don't pull an old buffer's leg when he's kicked the bucket," explained Lord Spratter to the two ladies. The canon shrugged his shoulders. You have no sense of decorum, no seemliness, no dignity. Good heavens, what can you expect? I don't feel important enough to strike attitudes. I'm just Tommy Tiddler, and I can't forget it. I might have done something if I'd had any name but Spratter. If it had been just Sprat, it would have been vulgar. But those two last letters make it pretentious as well. And that's what our honours are, vulgar and pretentious. I can't make out why the old buffer stuck to that beastly monosyllable. I always wish we could change with our butler, Theodore, said Lady Sophia. Don't you think it's very hard that he should be called Ponsonby and we— Spratter? I'm not ashamed of it, said the canon. You're ashamed of nothing, Theodore, retorted his brother. Now I'm different. I'm a modest sort of chap, and I can't stand all these gewgaws. I don't want the silly title with its sham coat of arms and its bogus pedigree, and those ridiculous ermine robes. The very thought of them makes my flesh creep. I should have been right enough if I'd just been plain Tom Spratt. I might have made a fairly good horse-dealer, and if I hadn't brains enough for that, I could always have gone into Parliament. I'd have been a capital First Lord of the Admiralty, because I can't tell a man-o'-war from a coal barge, and the mere sight of the briny ocean makes me feel sick. It's such as you who bring the upper house into discredit, exclaimed Theodore. Such as I, my dear brother? Why, I'm the saving of the place, because I have a sense of humour. I know we're no good. No one cares two straws about us, and they just leave us there because we do no harm, and they've forgotten all about us. I should like you to compare yourself with Harry Wroxham, said Canon Spratter. Though he's quite a young man, he has acquired a respected and assured position in the House of Lords. Yes, I know, replied the peer with much scorn. He fusses about, and he's a county councillor, and he speaks at church congresses. It's greatly to his credit that he's a steadfast champion of the Church of England. I dare say. All I know is that if there were 100 fellows in the House of Lords as enthusiastic as he is, the House of Lords would tumble down. The British public leaves us there as long as we don't interfere with it, but if ever we put on airs and try to stand on our hind legs, the British public will just take us by the scruff of the neck, and out we shall go. If we all took ourselves in earnest like Wroxham, we should just get the hoof, Brother Theodore. And do you ever go to the House of Lords, which you support by your sense of ridicule? Asked Mrs. Fitzherbert, her lips trembling into laughter. Certainly, I was there the other day. Dear me. Oh, it was quite accidental, he hastened to explain apologetically. I had to go to Westminster on business. On business, repeated the canon, full of contempt. Yes, to see a terrier that a man wanted to sell. Well, I had a new topper and no umbrella, and of course it began to rain. By Jove, I said, I'm hanged if I won't go and legislate for 10 minutes. I saw it was only a shower. Well, I walked in, and somebody asked who the dickens I was. Upon my word, I was almost ashamed to say. I look too bogus, Theodore. It's not the name that makes the man, said the canon sententiously. A rose by any other appellation would smell as sweet. There you're wrong, but I won't argue it out. Well, I went in and found 20 old buffers lying about on red benches. Half of them were asleep, and one was mumbling away in his beard. Good Lord, I said, who are their tailors? Then I said to myself, shall I stay here and listen to their twaddle, or shall I get my hat wet? Suddenly, I had an inspiration. By Jove, I thought, I'll take a cab. And that, Sophia, is the head of our house, said the canon in icy tones. Thomas, 2nd Earl Spratter of Beachcombe. But these words were hardly out of his mouth when there was a noisy ring at the bell of the front door. Canon Spratter started nervously. He collected himself to receive the expected messenger. Then came the sound of voices in the hall, and the canon put up his hand to request silence. Who can that be? He asked. Someone was heard running up the stairs, and the door was burst open by Lionel, for once in his life hurried and disturbed. "Oh, it's only you," said Canon Spratter, unable to conceal his disappointment. "I don't know why on earth you ring the bell as though the house were on fire." But Lionel waited to make no excuses. "I say, Father, is it true about Barchester?" "Is what true?" he asked, uncertain whether to be triumphant or dismayed. "It's announced that Dr. Gray, the headmaster of Harbin, has been appointed." "Impossible!" exclaimed the canon incredulously. "A trumpery headmaster who teaches ignorant schoolboys their ABC. It's in the evening paper." "Oh, it's ridiculous. It can't be true. I make the best of my fellow men, and I cannot bring myself to believe that Lord Stonehenge can be so foolish and wicked. The Westminster Gazette says it's a capital appointment." "The Westminster is a radical paper, Lionel, and will say anything. For all I know, Gray may be a radical too. I tell you it's preposterous. He's little better than an imbecile and a man of no family, a fool, a schoolmaster. I know innumerable things against him, but nothing in his favour, except that he was once tutor to one of Stonehenge's ill-mannered brats. I cannot think the government could be so grossly idiotic as to give an important bishopric to a man of Gray's powers." "Powers? They're not powers. He's the most ordinary and stupid man I've ever known. He's stupider than a churchwarden." "I confess I think it rather bad taste of Lord Stonehenge, considering that you dined with him only the other day," murmured Lady Sophia. "I thank heaven that I'm not a vain man," said the canon, somewhat oratorically. "I may have faults. We all have faults. But I don't think anyone has ever accused me of vanity. When it was suggested that I should be offered the bishopric of Barchester, the thought came upon me as a surprise. But this I will confess, I don't think I should have been out of place in that position. I have been mixed up with public affairs all my life, and I am used to authority, nor can I help thinking that I deserve something of my country." At this moment, Ponsonby passed through the drawing-room to the little terrace outside the window. He bore on a silver tray of imposing dimensions a kettle and a teapot. "I told them to put tea outside," said Lady Sophia. "I thought it would be pleasanter." Lord Spratt and Lionel got up, and with Lady Sophia passed through the large French window, but Mrs. Fitzherbert, seeing that the canon made no sign of following, stopped at the threshold. "Won't you come and have tea, Canon?" she asked. "Ah, my dear lady, at this moment I cannot think of tea. I could almost say that I shall never drink tea again." "Poor Canon Spratter, I feel so sorry for you," she smiled, half amused at his vexation, half tender because he was so like a spoiled child. He shrugged his shoulders. "It's not for myself that I feel sorry, it's for the people who have done this thing. It's charming of you to sympathize with me." He took her hand and pressed it. "I've often felt that you really understand me. It's a dreadful thing to live surrounded by persons who don't appreciate you. They say that no man is a prophet in his own country, and I have experienced that too. I'm glad you were here this afternoon, for you've seen how I'm surrounded by cynical laughter and by flippant vulgarity. They don't understand me." He sighed and smiled and patted the hand he held. "I don't want to say anything against Sophia. I dare say she does her best, and in this world we must be thankful for small mercies, but she hasn't the delicacy of sentiment necessary to understand a character like mine. Do you remember my wife, Mrs. Fitzherbert? She was an angel, wasn't she? Loving, obedient, respectful, self-effacing. She was all that a wife should be, but she was taken from me. I shall never quite get over it." "Now come and have tea," said Mrs. Fitzherbert, disengaging her hand. "I know it'll pull you together." "Oh, I could touch nothing," he cried, with a gesture of distaste. "I wouldn't venture to say it to anyone else, but to you who really understand me, I can say that if any man was fitted to be Bishop of Barchester, I am he. Anyone who knows me must be quite sure that it's not for my own sake that I wanted it, but think of the wonderful opportunities for doing good that such a position affords." And they've given it to Grey. He ended with a wrathful shrug of the shoulders. When he spoke again, there was a tremor in his voice, partly of righteous indignation, partly of despair at the folly of mankind. I speak entirely without prejudice, but honestly, do you think Dr. Grey fitted for such responsibilities? I certainly don't, replied Mrs. Fitzherbert, who till that day had never even heard of the distinguished pedagogue. I can't see that he has any claim at all. He's not a man of influence, he's not even a man of birth. Nobody ever heard of his father, while mine will be celebrated as long as English history is read. I can't tell you how sorry and disappointed I am. Canon Spratter paused in his indignant promenade and waved his hand picturesquely towards the open window. Ah, my dear friend, don't trouble yourself with my small annoyances. Go and have tea now. It will be bad for you if you keep it standing. And you, dear Canon? I will face the disappointment in the privacy of my own apartment. Mrs. Fitzherbert left him, and with a despondent sigh, he turned to go into his study. His glance fell on his father's portrait, and a thought came to him which in a layman might have expressed itself in the words, "By Jove, if he were alive, he'd make him skip." He shrugged his shoulders, and passing a looking-glass, paused to observe himself. Meditatively, he ran his fingers through his curly, abundant hair, and then, almost without thinking what he was about, took from his pocket a little comb and passed it through the disarranged locks. "I suppose I must go to Savile Row tomorrow and tell them they can set to work on those trousers," he muttered. 9. It was almost with a sense of disillusion that Winnie realized the fight was won. Feeling very truly that opposition would only have increased her determination to marry Bertram Railing, she would have been pleased in heroic mood to do more desperate battle for her love. She was like a man who puts out all his strength to lift an iron weight and finds it of cardboard, light, and hollow, so that he is sent sprawling on the ground. Winnie had braced herself to strenuous efforts, and since they were unneeded, the affair gained somewhat the look of a tragedy turned to farce. The conditions which the canon had set were precise, but easy. He gave no sanction to the engagement, but offered no hostility. Only for a year, nothing must be said about it to anyone. Railing was invited to luncheon at St. Gregory's Vicarage. Canon Spratter, though making no more than a passing, facetious reference to the connection with Winnie, behaved very politely. He was friendly and even cordial. The girl knew that both he and Lady Sophia examined her lover critically, and though she thought herself detestable, she could not help watching him also, nervously, in case he committed a solecism. But he was so frank, so natural, that everything he did gained a peculiar charm, and his good looks made Winnie love him each moment more devotedly. She was curious to know her aunt's opinion, but that the elderly lady took care neither by word nor manner to give, till she was asked outright. "My dear, if you love him, and your father approves, I don't think there's anything more to be said," she smiled. "I suppose he'll go into Parliament when you're married, and I dare say it's not a bad thing that he's a radical. The Liberals want clever young men with good connections, and doubtless your father will be able to get him made something or other." "He wouldn't consent to be made anything," said Winnie, with scornful pride. "After he's been married a few years, he'll no doubt take anything he can get," answered Lady Sophia mildly. "Ah, but you don't understand. We don't want to think of ourselves. We want to think of others. Have you ever faced the fact that people will ask you to their parties, but won't dream of asking him? Do you think I should go anywhere without my husband?" "I'm afraid you'll be rather bored," suggested Lady Sophia. Winnie reflected over this for a moment, then, chasing away a frown of indecision from her face, glanced happily at her aunt. "At all events, you'll allow that he's very handsome." "Certainly," said Lady Sophia. "I have only one fault to find with him. Aren't his legs a little short? I wonder if he can wear a frock-coat without looking stumpy." "Fortunately, he's absolutely indifferent to what he wears," laughed Winnie. Yes, I've noticed that. His clothes look as if they were bought ready-made. You must really take him to a good tailor. Canon Spratter would much have liked to inspect Mrs. Rayling and her daughter, but feared to excite Winnie's suspicion. He contented himself with urging Bertram to take her to Peckham, and when he made the suggestion, watched the youth keenly for signs of disinclination to produce his people. He saw nothing. I can't make out if the boy is simple or crafty, he said to himself irritably. It never struck him that Rayling could have so great an affection for his mother as to be indifferent to her defects. She's done everything for me, he told Winnie when they were in the train on their way to visit her. My father died when I was a lad, and it's only by her strength of will and sheer hard work that I've done anything at all. Winnie, overflowing with love for the handsome fellow, was prepared to look upon his mother with favourable eyes. Her imagination presented to her a Roman matron, toiling with silent patience to fit her son for a great work. There was something heroic in the thought of this unassuming person, educated in the hard school of poverty, preparing with inflexible courage the instrument for the regeneration of a people. She expected to find a powerful, stern woman whom, if it was impossible to love, she might at least admire. Winnie was sure that Mrs. Rayling had 1,000 interesting things to say about Bertram. I want to know what you were like when you were a boy, she said in her pretty, enthusiastic way. I want her to tell me so much. He kissed her fingers in the well-made gloves and looked at her with happy pride. Do you care for me, really? He asked. Sometimes I can't believe it. It seems too good to be true. Her eyes filled with tears. I feel so insignificant and so contemptible. I wish you knew how grateful I am to you for loving me. From the train, they had a glimpse of the Thames glistening vaguely in the sunny mist. But they came soon to long rows of little grey houses, which displayed with callous effrontery the details of their poverty. In the grimy backyards, clothes were hung out to dry on lines. Winnie, anxious to see only the more cheerful side of things, turned away to occupy herself entirely with Bertram's dark comeliness. On reaching Peckham, she looked for a cab, but her lover, to whom the idea of such luxury did not occur, set out to walk, and she, remembering that in future she must resist extravagance, dutifully followed. It's only about a mile and a bit, he said, stepping out briskly. At first glance, Winnie was not displeased with the bustle of the street. There was a welcome freshness in the air. The pavements were thronged, the roadway noisy with the rumble of buses and the clatter of tradesmen's carts. The shops were gay with all their crowded wares. After the dull respectability of South Kensington, the vivacity and the busy, strenuous eagerness were very exhilarating. The girl felt herself more in touch with humanity, and the surrounding life made her blood tingle pleasantly. She felt a singular glow as she realized what a manifold excitement there was merely in living. I don't think I should mind a house in the suburbs at all, she said. But at last, turning out of the main road, they came into a street which seemed interminable. There were little brick villas on either side in a long, straight row, and each house, with its bow window, its prim door and slate roof, was exactly like its fellow. Each had a tiny plot of lawn in front of it, about 4 feet square. The sky was grey, for the fitful sun had vanished, and the wind blew bitterly. The street, empty and cheerless, seemed very dreary. Winnie shuddered a little, feeling a sudden strange enmity towards the inhabitants of these dull places. She soon grew tired, for she was unused to walking, and asked whether they had still far to go. It's only just round the corner, he said. They turned, and another long row of little houses appeared, differing not at all from the first, and the likeness between each of these made her dizzy. It's worse than Bayswater, she murmured, with something like a groan of dismay. The exhilaration which at first she had felt was fast vanishing under fatigue and the east wind and the dull solitariness. Finally they came to a tiny villa, cheek by jowl with its neighbours, that appeared primmer, more sordid and grossly matter-of-fact than them all. Yet the name, let into the fanlight above the door in gold letters, was its only dissimilarity. It was called Balmoral. In the windows were cheap lace curtains. "Here we are," said Bertram, producing a latchkey. He led her into a narrow passage, the floor of which was covered with malodorous linoleum, and then into the parlour. It was a very small room, formal, notwithstanding Bertram's books neatly arranged on shelves. There was a close smell, as though it were rarely used, and the windows seldom opened. A table took up most of the floor. It was hidden by a large red cloth, stamped with a black pattern, but Winnie guessed at once that its top was of deal, and the legs elaborately carved in imitation mahogany. Against the wall was a piano, and all round a set of chairs covered with red velvet. On each side of the fireplace were armchairs of the same sort. Winnie's quick eye took in also the elaborate gilded clock with a shepherd kneeling to a shepherdess under a glass case, and this was flanked by candlesticks to match similarly protected. The chimney-piece was swathed in pale green draperies. Opposite the looking-glass was a painting in oils of the brig Mary Ann, on which Thomas Railing had sailed many an adventurous journey, and next to this was a portrait of the seaman himself, no less wooden than the ship. He wore black broadcloth of a funereal type and side whiskers of great luxuriance. "Mother!" cried Bertram. "Mother! Coming!" It was a fat, good-natured voice, but even in that one word the Cockney accent was aggressive and unmistakable. Mrs. Railing appeared, smoothing the sleeves of the Sunday dress which she had just put on. She was a short, stout woman of an appearance politely termed comfortable. Her red face, indistinct of feature, shone with good humour and with soap, the odour of which proceeded from her with undue distinctness. Her hair was excessively black. There was certainly nothing in her to remind one of Bertram's sensitive, beautiful face. Smiling pleasantly, she shook hands with Winnie. "Louis hasn't come in yet, Bertie," she said, and the lacking aspirate sent a blush to Winnie's cheek. "Fine day, isn't it?" she added, by way of beginning the conversation. Winnie agreed that it was, and Bertram suggested that they should have tea at once. "It's all ready," said his mother. She looked somewhat uncertainly at the bell, as though not sure whether it would be discreet to ring, and gave her son a questioning glance. Then, making up her mind, she pulled it. The shrill sound was heard easily in the parlour, and Mrs. Railing remarked complacently, "It has rung." But there was no other answer than the sound of voices in the kitchen. "Is anyone here?" asked Bertram. "Mrs. Cooper popped in to see me, and she's been helping me get the tea ready." Bertram's face darkened, and his mother turned to Winnie with an explanation. "Bertie can't abide Mrs. Cooper somehow," she said in her voluble, good-tempered way. "You don't know Mrs. Cooper, do you? She lives in Shepherd's Bush. Such a nice woman and a thorough lady." "Oh, yes," said Winnie politely, "but Bertie can't abide her. I don't deny that she does take a little drop more than's good for her, but she's had a rare lot of trouble." Bertram said nothing, and in an awkward pause they waited for the tea. "I think I'd better go and see if anything has happened," said Mrs. Railing. "We don't generally have tea in here, except when we have company, and that girl of mine can't be trusted to do anything unless I'm watching of her all the time." But Railing rang the bell again impatiently. After a further sound of voices raised in acrimonious dispute, the door was opened about 6 inches, and the dishevelled head of a frowsy girl was thrust in. "Do you want anything?" "Do I want anything?" cried Mrs. Railing indignantly. "I suppose you think I ring the bell for me health? I suppose I've got nothing better to do than to ring the bell all day long. Didn't I tell you to bring the tea the moment that Bertie come in?" "Well, I'm bringing it," came from the head crossly, and the door was closed with a bang. "Oh, them girls," said Mrs. Railing. "They're more trouble than they're worth, and that's the truth. The number of girls I've had, well, I couldn't count 'em. They eat you out of house and home, and they're always grumbling, and you have to pay 'em 5 shillings now. They won't come for less, and they're not worth it. I have to do all the work myself, and they're that particular in their eating. I never see anything like it. They must have the best of everything, just the same as we have, if you please." Mrs. Railing's red face grew redder still as she described the tribulations which attend the mistress of servants. "She broke another plate today, Bertie," she said. "I shall give a notice this week. If she stays there much longer, I shan't have a plate in the house." There was a knock at the door, with a clatter of cups, and Mrs. Railing opened it. A tall, gaunt woman carefully brought in the tray with the tea things. She wore a bonnet and a shabby cloak, decorated with black beads. "Oh, you've not brought it yourself, Mrs. Cooper," cried Mrs. Railing, hastily taking the tray from her. "Why didn't you let the girl bring it? What's she here for? And I pay her 5 shillings a week." "Oh, I thought she'd break something." Mrs. Cooper gave Winnie an inquisitive look and turned to go. "Now you're not going, Mrs. Cooper." "I know where I'm not wanted, Mrs. Railing," replied the other, with a sour glance at Bertram. "Now don't say that, Mrs. Cooper. You don't want her to go, Bertie, do you?" "I should be pleased if you'd stay and have tea, Mrs. Cooper," said Bertram, driven into a corner. "I've had him in me arms many a time when he was a baby," said Mrs. Cooper, with a defiant glare at Bertram. "And I've bathed him." Mrs. Railing stirred the tea, put milk in each cup, and poured out. "I hope you won't mind if it's not very grand," said she to Winnie apologetically. "Not the Queen of England could make a better cup of tea than you, Mrs. Railing," replied Mrs. Cooper, sitting down with a certain aggressiveness. "Well, I've got a silver teapot," said Mrs. Railing, smiling proudly. "Bertie and Louis gave it me only last week for me birthday." Mrs. Cooper sniffed and pursed her lips. "I don't know why you call it silver, when it's not all marked Mrs. Railing," she said. "And I know it's not that because I've looked. It's electroplate, but we call it silver by courtesy," laughed Bertram. "I'm a woman as calls a spade," answered Mrs. Cooper with sombre dignity. The bread was cut with the best intentions, but it was thick and plastered with slabs of butter. The tea, by way of showing hospitality, was so strong that no amount of sugar could remove the bitterness. "I say, what a beautiful cake!" cried Bertram. "I made it with my own hands," said Mrs. Railing, much gratified. "There's no one like Mother for making cakes," said Bertram, regaining his spirits, which had been damped by the appearance of Mrs. Cooper. But this remark was taken by that lady as a deliberate slight to herself. "You've got no cause to say that, Bertie," she remarked bitterly. "Many's the cake you've eaten of my making in my house at Shepherd's Bush, and they was quite good enough for you then." "You make excellent cakes too, Mrs. Cooper," he answered, but she was not to be so easily appeased. "I take it very hard that you should treat me like this, Bertie," she added, in a lachrymose way, "and you wouldn't have been alive today if it hadn't been for me." "No, that you wouldn't, Bertie," acknowledged his mother. "I'll tell you how it was," said Mrs. Cooper, turning to Winnie. "I just popped in here to have a little chat with Mrs. Railing, and there was Bertie in such a state. I never see anything like it. He'd convulsions, and he was blue all over and stiff. Oh, he was a sight, I can tell you. Well, he was only 4 months old, and Mrs. Railing was in a rare state. You see, he was a first, and she didn't know what to do no more than a cat would. And I said, 'It's no good sending for the doctor, Mrs. Railing,' I said. 'He'll be dead before the doctor comes. You put him in a raw bath,' I said, with a pinch of mustard in it. And it saved his little life." "I will say that for you, Mrs. Cooper. You do know what to do with babies," said Mrs. Railing. "And I take it very hard that should call me a drunken old woman," added Mrs. Cooper, putting a handkerchief to her eyes. "I've known you for 30 years, Mrs. Railing, and I ask you, Have you ever seen me with more than I can carry? That I haven't, Mrs. Cooper, and you mustn't mind what Bertie says. He didn't mean to speak sharply to you. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Railing, and I never thought I should live to hear Bertie say such things to me. Last time I come here, he said, "Don't you come to my house again, Mrs. Cooper. You're a drunken old woman." The tears coursed down her cheeks, and she blew her nose loudly. And I've had him to stay in my house at Shepherd's Bush over and over again, and I used to wash him myself and comb his hair, and I made a rare lot of him. I take it very hard that he should say I'm not to pop in and have a chat with an old friend when I'm in the neighbourhood. Bertram looked at her anxiously, afraid to speak in case there was a scene. But this apparently was just what Mrs. Cooper wanted. "I've had a very hard life," she said, with maudlin tears. "I've had a lot of trouble with my husband, and I've brought up 7 children, and brought them all up to earn their own living. And if I do take a little drop now and then, it's because I want it, and I don't take gin like some people do." This was obviously a home thrust, for Mrs. Railing, with a gasp, drew herself together like a war horse panting for the fray. "I don't know what you mean by that, Mrs. Cooper, but no one can call me a drunken old woman." "I know all about you, Mrs. Railing, and I know a great deal more than Bertie does, and if he wants to know, I'll tell him." Mrs. Railing turned so purple that it was quite alarming. "Oh, you're a wicked woman, Mrs. Cooper, and what your husband said to me only the week before last is quite true. Your husband had something to put up with, I lay, and he's told me over and over again what sort of a lady you are." "Now then, mother, for heaven's sake don't quarrel with her now," cried Bertram. "And what did my husband say to you, Mrs. Railing?" "Never you mind, Mrs. Cooper. I'm not one to go and repeat what's been said to me privately." Winnie had watched them with increasing alarm, and now, growing terrified, as there seemed every prospect of a battle royal, stood up. "Bertram, it's time for me to go away." "I'll take you to the station," he said, pale with anger. Winnie shook hands with Bertram's mother, ruffled and hot, but pointedly ignored Mrs. Cooper. She walked past her as though no one was in the way. When they were in the street, Bertram turned to her with pleading eyes. "I'm so sorry this has happened, darling. I had no idea that awful person would be here. My mother's the best creature in the world, but she's had a very hard time, and like many women of that age, is inclined sometimes to drink a little more than is good for her. My sister and I are trying to get her to become a teetotaler, and Mrs. Cooper leads her on. I've told her never to come to the house, but my mother doesn't like to hurt her feelings. She made that horrible scene just to spite me, because you were here." "It doesn't much matter, does it?" said Winnie very wearily. "I'm not going to marry your relations. You're not angry with me, dearest?" "Not at all," said Winnie, forcing a smile to her lips. "Please get me a cab. I'll drive home." "It's too far, dearest. You must go by train. A cab would cost you a fortune." "Well, what does it matter?" she answered irritably. "I can afford to pay for it." "I'm afraid there won't be one here. You see, it's so out of the world." "Must I walk all the way along those dreary roads to the station?" "It's not far." They went in silence, both of them very unhappy, and Winnie angry as well, angry with herself and with all the world. And when at length they came again to the high street, the scene in Winnie's eye had changed its hue. The din of the traffic was insufferable to her ears, and the press of people, making it difficult to thread one's way, irritated her insanely. In their faces she saw now only a stupid mediocrity, and the petty cares which occupied them stamped their features with commonness. The gay shops were become sordid and mean. Jewelers showed silver bangles and silver brooches, low-priced and tawdry, red and green glass, which masqueraded impudently under the beautiful names of emerald and ruby. Milliners offered the purchaser hats and bonnets in loud colours, imitating inexpensively what they thought the fashion of Paris. Other shops exposed the hideous details of commonplace existence: pots and pans, mangles, crockery, brushes and brooms. All things which artists had touched with their fashioning fingers, carpets and furniture, pictures and statuettes, were cheaply parodied. Nowhere could be found restraint or modesty, but everything was flaunting and pretentious, gaudy, cheap and vulgar. Winnie bit her lip to prevent herself from speaking, but what she wished to say was this: "How can you talk of ideals with these people who only want to make a show, whose needs are so ignoble and paltry? Their very faces tell you how little they care for beauty and grace and virtue." At the station, Bertram asked uncertainly whether she would not like him to accompany her to South Kensington. "Please not," she answered. "I can get home quite well alone. Will you excess my ticket?" They had come third class, but now she wished to be in a carriage by herself. He put her in when the train came and wistfully leaned forward. "Won't you kiss me, dearest?" Listlessly, with unsmiling mouth, she offered her lips. He kissed them, with eyes painfully yearning, but she, for the moment the train still lingered, kept hers averted. "I'm so dreadfully tired," she said, by way of excuse. Quickly the guard whistled, and the train steamed away. Winnie, thankful at last to be alone, huddled into the corner as though to hide herself. She burst out weeping, passionately, hopelessly. 10. Canon Spratty was dispirited. Certain words which Lady Sophia had used in a discussion upon Winnie's engagement dwelt in his mind with discomforting persistence. The deliberate fashion with which she spoke gave a peculiar authority to her sayings, and though he roundly scoffed at them, the canon could not help the feeling of uneasiness they left behind. "After all, you can say what you like, Theodore, but in point of fact, we belong to just the same class as Bertram Railing. Are you sure that Winnie is not merely sinking to our proper level? It's a tendency with families like ours that have come up in the world, and with most of us, to keep up our nobility is just swimming against the stream." "You're mixing your metaphors, Sophia, and I haven't an idea what you mean." "Well, in our heart of hearts, we're bourgeois, we're desperately bourgeois, but I suspect it's just the same with others as it is with us. In the last 50 years, so many tinkers, tailors, and spectacle makers have pitchforked themselves into the upper classes, and very few of them are quite at home. Some are continually on the alert to uphold their dignity, trying to hide by the stupid pretentiousness of a bogus genealogy in Burke, the grandfather who was a country attorney, or a plate-layer, or a groom. Some, with the energy still in them of all those ancestors who were honest shopkeepers or artisans, throw themselves from sheer boredom into every kind of dissipation." "You talk like a radical tub-thumper," said Canon Spratty with disdain. Lady Sophia shrugged her shoulders. "And after all, however much they struggle, the majority, sooner or later, sink back into the ranks of the middle classes, and once there, with what a comfortable ease they wallow." "Facilis descensus Averni," he murmured. "Lord Stonehenge can make earldoms and baronies galore. But what's the good when the instincts of these new noblemen, their habits and virtues and vices, are bourgeois to the very marrow?" Lady Sophia looked at her brother for an indignant denial of these statements, but to her surprise he answered nothing. He was very thoughtful. "Don't you know shoals of them?" she said. "Young men who would make quite passable doctors or fairly honest lawyers, and who wear their hereditary honors like clothes, several sizes too large for them. They meander through life aimlessly, like fish out of water. Look at Sir Peter Mason, whose father was president of some medical body at the Jubilee, and managed with difficulty to scrape up the needful £30,000 to accept a baronetcy. Peter was then a medical student, whose ambition it was to buy a little practice in the country and marry his cousin Bertha. Well, now he's a baronet, and Bertha thinks it bad form that he should drive about in a dog-cart to see patients at 5 shillings a visit. So they live in Essex because it's cheap and try to keep up their dignity on 1,000 a year, and they're desperately bored. Have you never met rather dowdy girls who've spent their lives in Bayswater or in some small, dull terrace at South Kensington, till their father, in the seesaw of politics, was made a peer? How clumsily they bear their twopenny titles, how self-consciously, and with what relief they marry some obscure young man in the city. Canon Spratter looked at his sister for a moment, and when he answered, it was only by a visible effort that his voice remained firm. Sophia, if Winnie marries beneath her, it will break my heart. Yes, you're the other sort of nouvelle noblesse, Theodore. You're the sort that's always struggling to get on equal terms with the old. Sophia, Sophia. What do you suppose Lady Wroxham said when Harry told her he wanted to marry Winnie? She's a charming woman, and she has a deeply religious spirit, Sophia. Yes, but all the same I have an idea that she raised those thin eyebrows of hers, and in that quiet, meek voice asked, "Winnie Spratter, Harry, do you think the Spratters are quite up to your form?" "I should think it extremely snobbish if she said anything of the sort," retorted the canon with all his old fire. The conversation dropped, but he could not help it if some of these observations rankled. Lionel, on whom depended the future of the stock, proposed to marry a brewer's daughter, and Winnie was positively engaged to a man of no family. It looked indeed as though his children were sinking back into the ranks, whence, with so much trouble, his father had emerged. Nor did the second Earl conceal his scorn for the family honours. His coronet, with the strawberry leaves and the lifted pearls, he kicked hither and thither verbally like a football, and the ermine cloak was a scarlet rag which never ceased to excite his derision. "I'm the only member of the family who has a proper sense of his dignity," sighed the canon. But when he heard that Winnie, on her return from Peckham Rye, had gone to her room with a headache, he chased away these gloomy thoughts. Even paternal affection could not prevent him from rubbing his hands with satisfaction. "And I thought she wouldn't be very well after a visit to Mr. Railing's mamma," he said. When she entered the drawing-room, he went towards her with outstretched hands. "Ah, my love, I see you've returned safely from the wilds of Peckham. I hope you encountered no savage beasts in those unfrequented parts." Winnie, with a little groan of exhaustion, sank into a chair. Her head was aching still, and her eyes were red with many tears. Canon Spratter assumed his most affable manner. His voice was a marvel of kindly solicitude, and only in a note here and there was perceptible a suspicion of banter. "I hope you enjoyed yourself, my pet. You know the only wish I have in the world is to make you happy. And did your prospective mother-in-law take you to her capacious bosom?" "She was very kind, father." "I imagine that she was not exactly polished." "I didn't expect her to be," answered Winnie, in so dejected a tone that it would have melted the heart of anyone less inflexible than Theodore Spratt. "But I suppose you didn't really mind that much, did you? True disinterestedness is such a beautiful thing, and in this world, alas, so rare." A sullen, defiant look came into Winnie's face. "I mean to marry Bertram in spite of everything, Papa." "My darling, whoever suggested that you shouldn't? By the way, do they call him Bertie?" "Yes, they call him Bertie." "I thought they would," answered the canon, with the triumphant air of a man who has found some important hypothesis verified by fact. "And Mrs. Railing's husband, I think you said, was connected with the sea. He was first mate on a collier?" "Oh, yes. And does she smack of the briny, or does she smack of Peckham Rye?" The canon burst into song, facetiously, with a seaman's roll, hoisting his slacks. His singing voice was melodious and full of spirit. "For I'm no sailor bold, and I've never been upon the sea, and if I fall therein, it's a fact I couldn't swim. and quickly at the bottom I should be. He threw back his head gaily. My dear, how uncommunicative you are, and I'm dying with curiosity. Tell me all about Mrs. Railing. Ageless, I presume? Oh, Papa, how can you, cried Winnie, hardly keeping back the tears. My dear, I have no doubt they are rough diamonds, but you mustn't be discouraged at that. You must make the best of things. Remember that externals are not everything, even in this world. I'm sure the Railings are thoroughly worthy people. It is doubtless possible to eat peas with a knife and yet to have an excellent heart. One of the most saintly women I ever knew, the old Marquise de Suresnes, used invariably to wipe her knife and fork with a table napkin before eating. His words, notwithstanding the tone of great tenderness, were bitter stabs, and Canon Spratter, as he spoke, really could not help admiring his own cleverness. I should imagine that your fiancé was devoted to his mother and sister. People of that class always are. You will naturally be a good deal together. In fact, I think it probable that they will make you long and frequent visits. One's less desirable relations are such patterns of affection. They're always talking of the beauty of a united family. But I'm quite sure that you'll soon accustom yourself to their slight eccentricities of diction, to their little vulgarities of manner. Remember always that kind hearts are more than coronets and simple faith than Norman blood. But Winnie could hold herself in no longer. Oh, they were awful, she cried, putting her hands to her eyes. What shall I do? What shall I do? Canon Spratter, still in the swing of his rhetoric, stood in front of her. A faint smile was outlined on his lips. Was this the critical moment when the final blow might be effectively delivered? Should he suggest that it was the easiest thing in the world to break off the engagement with Bertram? He hesitated. After all, there was no need to take things hurriedly, and Providence notoriously sided with discretion and the large battalions. If Winnie suffered, it was for her good, and it was a cherished maxim with Canon Spratter that suffering was salutary. He had said in the pulpit frequently, he was too clever a man to hesitate to repeat himself, that the human soul was brought to its highest perfection only through distress, mental or bodily. Man is ennobled by pain, he said, looking so handsome that it must have been a cynic indeed who doubted that he spoke sense. Our character is refined to pure gold. The gross lusts of the flesh, the commonness which is in all of us, the pettiness of spirit, disappear in these profitable afflictions. From a bed of sickness may spring the most delicate flowers of unselfishness, of devotion, and of true saintliness. Do not seek to avoid pain, but accept it as the surest guide to all that is in you of beauty, of heavenliness, and of truth. For his own part, when forced to visit his dentist for the extraction of a tooth, he took good care to have gas properly administered. In the present instance, he looked upon himself as a surgeon who applies irritation that the ragged edges of an ulcer may inflame and heal. Possibly there was also in his determination to strike no sudden blow, a certain human weakness from which Canon Spratter often confessed he was not exempt. He had not the heart to interrupt the scheme which he had so ingeniously devised. He was like a debater who has convinced his adversary by the first section of an argument, but for his own pleasure and in the interests of truth, duly exposes the rest of his contention. He sat down at the little writing table, which was in the drawing-room, and scribbled a note. He took out an envelope. By the way, my love, what is the address of dear Mrs. Railing? Winnie looked up with astonishment. What do you want it for? Come, my darling, it's nothing improper, I hope. Balmoral, Rosebery Gardens, Gladstone Road. It sounds quite aristocratic, he said suavely. Their liberalism is evidently a family tradition. He fastened the envelope and, blotting it, rose from the desk. I consider it my duty to be as cordial as possible to your future relations, Winnie, and I have a natural curiosity to make their acquaintance. I have asked Mrs. Railing to bring her daughter to tea, and I shall ask your uncle to meet them." "Oh, father, you don't know what they're like." "My dear, I don't expect to find them highly educated. I take it they are rough diamonds with hearts of gold. I'm prepared to like Mrs. Railing." "Papa, don't ask anyone else. She drinks." "Well, well, we all have our little failings in this world," returned the canon blandly. He had gone too far. Winnie gave him a long, keen look, and the old note of defiance came back to her face. "I hope you don't think I can ever break my engagement with Bertram. Nothing on earth shall induce me to do that. I've given him my solemn promise, and I'd sooner die than break it." The canon raised his eyebrows in a very good imitation of complete amazement. "My dear, I have not the least intention of thwarting you in any way. I think it wrong and even wicked for a father to attempt to influence his children's matrimonial choice. Their youth and inexperience naturally make them so much more capable of judging for themselves." 11. One evening, to his sister's amazement, Canon Spratter volunteered to accompany Winnie to a party. The vicar of St. Gregory's was at his best in smaller gatherings where his personality could more easily make itself felt. He liked an attentive audience, and even one careless pair, more anxious to talk with one another than to hear his sage words, was apt to disconcert him. When he found himself in a crowd, jostled and pushed, able to speak with but one person at a time, and reduced even then to social commonplace, he quickly grew bored. He could only suffer a multitude when from the safe eminence of the pulpit, the first in place as well as in dignity of oratorial machines, he was lifted above the press of mankind. He was assured then of their attentiveness and protected from their interruption. Winnie was very simply dressed. Her pallor was unusual, but in the soft light of shaded electricity she gained thereby a peculiar delicacy. The pose of her head was a little wearied. The blue eyes were filled with melancholy. The canon thought her frail beauty had never been seen to greater advantage, and when, alert for all that was proceeding, he saw Wroxham coming towards them, he quickly vanished from her side. He smiled as he noticed the singular way in which the young man held his nose in the air. Wroxham was very short-sighted, and his prominent blue eyes had an odd helplessness of expression. Winnie did not see him. She was watching the throng of dancers, taking a new delight in the gaiety of those many people gathered there in lightness of heart to enjoy the fleeting moments. Never before had she found such satisfaction in the magnificence of the ballroom, hung with red roses, nor in the charming dresses of the women. She could not crush a pang that entered her breast when she thought that all this must be given up, and in sudden contrast she saw the little sordid parlour in Rosebery Gardens. Before her eyes arose the High Street at Peckham with its gaudy shops. It was hideous, hideous, and she shuddered. Suddenly she heard in her ear a well-known voice. "Winnie!" Her pallor gave way before a blush that made her 10 times prettier. She did not answer, but looked at Harry. In his eyes, herself quickened by suffering, she thought there was a new sadness, and a great sympathy filled her. If he lacked good looks, he had at all events the kindly face of an old friend. And he was admirably dressed. Discovering for the first time that his clothes had never before attracted her attention, she observed now with what an incomparable ease he bore them. The cruel advice of Lady Sophia to get Bertram a good tailor recurred to her, and she remembered the suggestion that he could not wear a frock coat becomingly. "I wonder if he knows it," passed through her mind. "Perhaps that's why he always wears a jacket." It was an unwelcome thought that Bertram could be influenced by vain notions, and she upbraided herself for the pettiness of the suspicion. Wroxham, without fear of ridicule and with simplicity, could wear any clothes he chose. "I knew I should find you here," he was saying. You're not angry with me for coming? I wanted to see you so badly." "Good heavens, why should I be angry?" smiled Winnie. "You have just as much right to come as I." She could not help being flattered by the passionate love which coloured every word he spoke, and her own voice gained a sweeter tenderness. "I can't keep away from you, Winnie. I didn't know I loved you so much." "Oh, don't please," she murmured. "We've been friends for ages. It would be absurd if we never saw one another again because of the other day. You know I'm always glad to see you." I couldn't take your answer as final. "Oh, I don't want to bother you and make you miserable, but don't you care for me at all? Don't you think that, after a time, you may get to like me?" His humility touched Winnie so much that it made her answer very difficult. "I told you the other day it was impossible." "Oh, I know, but then I couldn't say what I wanted. I couldn't understand. Like a fool, I thought you cared for me. I loved you so passionately that it seemed impossible I should be nothing to you at all." "Please don't say anything more, Harry," she said very gently. "It's awfully kind of you, and I don't know how to thank you, but I can't marry you." Wroxham, with a little instinctive motion, set the glasses more firmly on his nose and looked at her sadly. She smiled. "Won't you dance with me?" she said. His face lit up as he placed his arm round her waist, and they began to waltz. The rhythm of the haunting melody carried Winnie's soul away. She knew that she was giving great happiness, and it filled her with pleasure. The music stopped, and with a sigh of delight, she sank into a chair. "I want to tell you something," he said presently, with much seriousness. "If ever you change your mind, I shall be waiting for you. I can never love anyone else. I don't want you to make any promise or to give me any encouragement. But I shall wait for you. And if ever the time comes that you think you can care for me, you will find me ready and eager to be your very humble servant." "I didn't know you were so kind," said she, with tears in her eyes. "I misjudged you. I thought you treated me like a fool. I'm sorry. I want you to be happy. But don't be wretched, because I can't marry you. I'm not worth troubling about." He looked at her fixedly, divining from her tone that something was troubling her. "Is anything the matter?" he asked. "No, what should be?" she answered, trying to smile, but blushing to the roots of her hair. "You've been crying." "I had a headache. There's really nothing else." It was very hard to resist her impulse to confess that she was already engaged. She wished him to know why she had refused him and wanted his loving sympathy. But at this moment, a partner claimed her for the dance that was just beginning. "Goodbye," she whispered as she left him. "I shall never forget your kindness." Wroxham followed her with his eyes, then, puzzled and uncertain, walked towards the door. Canon Spratter did not believe in trusting the affairs of this world to the blind hazard of chance, and it was by no accident that he found himself at this very moment in the young man's way. "Ah, my dear fellow, I'm delighted to see you," he said. "What a crowd, isn't there? I've been dying to find someone to smoke a quiet cigarette with me." Wroxham gave him a smile. He felt at once that cordial glow which Canon Spratter invariably suffused on all with whom he came in contact. They went to the smoking-room. Even if Wroxham had been unwilling, he would have found it hard to resist the breezy authoritativeness with which the canon, waiting for no answer, led the way. "Now let us make ourselves at home." He seated himself in the most comfortable armchair, and for all the world as if he were in his own house, pointed Wroxham to another. In his gracious way, he offered the young man a cigarette from their host's box, and having lit his own, smoked for a while in silence. He was willing to let things take their time, and waited contentedly for Wroxham to speak. He set his mind to making a number of admirable smoke rings. "I've been talking to Winnie," said the other at last, gravely. "Well?" Well? I don't understand her. Canon Spratter put his hand impressively on Wroxham's knee. My dear fellow, there's nothing to understand. They say that women are incomprehensible. They're nothing of the sort. I've never met a woman that I couldn't understand at a glance. I fancied she'd been crying, said Wroxham shyly. All women cry when they have nothing better to do. It's the only inexpensive form of amusement they have. Wroxham knocked the ash off his cigarette with peculiar care. I asked her to marry me, Canon Spratter. And of course she refused. That was to be expected. No nice girl accepts a man the first time he proposes to her. My dear Harry, the way with women is to insist. Stand no nonsense from them. Treat them kindly but firmly. Remember that the majority never know their own minds. And between you and me, I think the majority haven't much to know. The canon was no feminist. It was one of his cherished convictions that women should be kept in their place, which, with regard to the lords of creation, was chiefly the background. He felt that the attitude which best became them was one of submission. Like the natural savage, unspoiled by the vice of civilization, he considered that man should hunt, fight, and be handsome, while the weaker sex toiled for the privilege of contemplating his greatness. He had never imparted these theories to Lady Sophia. When you want something from a woman, insist upon having it, he added. Hammer away, and in the long run you'll get it. But Winnie is so different from other girls, replied Wroxham, unconvinced. Nonsense. Every man thinks the girl he wants to marry different from every other. But she's nothing of the kind. Women are very much of a muchness, especially the pretty ones. I have no patience with this ranting about the equality of the sexes. It is not only irreligious, but vulgar. I lay my faith on the Bible, which tells us that women shall be subject unto man. I've never met the woman that I couldn't turn round my little finger. He looked at that particular digit. It was adorned with a handsome ring, on which in all their monstrous fraudulence were the arms of his family. His voice rang with manly scorn. No, my dear Harry, you have my full approval, and you have my assurance that Winnie undoubtedly cares for you. What more can you want? Hammer away, my dear sir, hammer away. The proper fashion to deal with a woman is to ask her in season and out of season. Propose to her morning, noon, and night. Worry her as a terrier worries a bone. Insist on marrying her. Sooner or later she'll say yes, and think herself a prodigious fool for not having done so before. You're very encouraging, said the lover, smiling. Canon Spratter's cheery vigour was irresistible, and the force of his rhetoric seemed to overcome even material obstacles. But when Wroxham considered the affair, he was puzzled. He was a youth of only common intelligence. This the canon had observed with satisfaction, for he knew that nothing is so prejudicial in the world of politics as to excel the average. It did not appear natural that Winnie should refuse him out of mere virginal coyness, as the hen-bird flies from the nightingale till he has sung his most amorous lays. Her melancholy pointed to something more complex. You're very encouraging, he repeated, but this time with a sigh. There are few men who have more experience in the management of the sex than I, returned Canon Spratter, with the air of a sultan who has conducted with unexampled success a seraglio of more than common dimensions. Now, what do you propose to do? I don't know, answered Wroxham somewhat helplessly. My dear fellow, God helps those who help themselves, said the canon with sharpness. You want to marry my little girl, and I want you to marry her. I know no one to whom I would sooner entrust her, and when a father says that, I can assure you it means a good deal. But what can I do? Well, I see I must help you a little. Come and see us again in a day or two. I'll drop you a line. I don't want to be a bore, said Wroxham. I have reason to believe that you'll find Winnie in a different state of mind. Keep yourself free to come any day I fix, and now go home and have a good night's sleep." Wroxham got up and shook hands. He left the canon in the smoking room. The clerical gentleman put down his cigarette and smiled to himself with much self-satisfaction. He sang again softly, "For I'm no sailor bold, and I've never been upon the sea, and if I fall therein, it's a fact I couldn't swim, and quickly at the bottom I should be." He returned to the ballroom jauntily, and on his way was so fortunate as to meet Mr. Wilson. This was the journalist of much influence in ecclesiastical circles, whose good offices with the press he had already made use of. "Ah, my dear Wilson, it was charming of you to put that little announcement in the paper for me," he said. "I'm rejoiced to see that Dr. Gray has been given the bishopric." "I'm afraid the news is entirely premature," answered the other. "No appointment has been made at all." "Indeed, you surprise me. It was announced so confidently in the Westminster Gazette." "Even the newspapers are not infallible," smiled Mr. Wilson, who knew. "In point of fact, I very much doubt if Gray would accept. He's fond of the work at Harbin, and I don't think he much wants to bury himself at Barchester." "Of course, in this world everything has its drawbacks," replied the vicar of St. Gregory's, "and for my part, when a man is still young and vigorous, I can imagine no position with greater opportunities for good than the headmastership of a great public school." He passed on. His name had been somewhat freely mentioned with regard to Barchester, and Canon Spratt could not bear that anyone should think him disappointed or envious. He had shown Mr. Wilson that he was neither. But he could not regret that the newspapers had anticipated things, and hope, which is known to spring eternally in human breasts, cast at once a rosy hue upon the world in general. So long as no definite appointment was made, the canon felt it only right to trust in the victory of good over evil. The various influences which he had brought to bear might still cause in Lord Stonehenge a state of mind that would raise merit to the episcopal bench. Canon Spratter looked round the ballroom and caught sight of Gwendolen Durant. He went up to her at once. She looked uncommonly well in her low-necked dress, and the single string of pearls she wore not only showed off the youthful beauty of her neck, but reminded the world at large that she had a very opulent father. "How is it the young men are so ungallant as to leave you sitting out?" he asked gaily. "I'm engaged to your son for this dance. I can't make out where he is." "Lionel is a donkey," laughed the canon. "Give it to me instead." He would not listen to her amused objections, and in a moment they were among the dancers. Lionel came up just as Canon Spratter had borne off the prize triumphantly. He was filled with amazement, for to the best of his belief his father had not danced for 20 years. The canon saw him, and laughing at his disconsolate look, pointed him out to Gwendolen. She laughed also. "I've cut you out, dear boy," cried the canon as they passed, with a roguish look. "I've cut you out." "You're very unkind," smiled Gwendolen. "Nonsense. It'll teach him to be more punctual. Do you think if I'd been engaged to the belle of the evening, I should have kept her waiting one single moment?" He was so good-looking, and there was about him such a buoyant charm of manner, that Gwendolen was somewhat dazzled. The canon had a great sense of rhythm, and their waltz went exceedingly well. "You dance better than Lionel," she said, smiling. He pressed her hand slightly in acknowledgment of the flattering remark, and his glance, positively, made her heart beat a little. "You mustn't think because my hair is nearly white that I'm quite an old fossil." Gwendolen looked at his hair and thought it very handsome. She was pleased with the admiration that filled his eyes when they caught hers. She blushed, and they danced for a while in silence. "I enjoyed that more than any dance this evening," she sighed, when the music ceased. "Then you must give me another. I owe you a debt of gratitude. You've made me feel 24. "I don't believe you're a day more," she answered, reddening at her boldness. Like many young persons before her, Gwendolen felt that a week's acquaintance with Theodore Spratter had turned him into an old friend. She would have confided to him her most treasured secrets without hesitation. He took her to have an ice, and she observed with pleasure the courtliness with which he used her. It seemed more than politeness, which made him so anxious for her comfort. Her wants really seemed to matter to him. "How charmingly you wait on me," she said, half laughing. "I belong to the old school which put lovely women on a gilded pedestal and worshipped them. Besides, I have to take pains to make you forget my age." "How can you be so absurd?" she cried. "I think you're the youngest man I've ever known." He was delighted, for he saw that Gwendolen meant precisely what she said. "Ah, why don't we live in the 18th century so that I might fall on my knee and kiss your hand in gratitude for that pretty speech?" The band struck up again, and the canon, offering his arm, led her back to the ballroom. She was claimed by a young guardsman, and as she swung into the throng, the canon could not help feeling that neither in appearance, height, nor gallantry had he anything to fear from the comparison. "Upon my soul, I can't make out why I don't come to balls oftener," he murmured. "I had no idea they were so amusing." Lionel was standing just in front of him, and he slapped him on the back. "Well, my boy, are you enjoying yourself? I hope you bear me no malice because I robbed you of your partner." "Not at all. I'm not really very fond of dancing." "Ah, you young men of the present day are so superior. It's a monstrous thing that when a girl's pretty feet itch for a varnished floor, she should be forced to throw herself into the arms of an old fogey like myself." "It didn't look as if Miss Durant needed much compulsion," returned Lionel dryly. The canon laughed boisterously. "Have you declared yourself yet? She's a very nice girl indeed, and you have my paternal blessing. I think we shall get on capitally together." "No, I haven't said anything." "Well, my boy, why don't you? It's your duty to marry, and it's your duty to marry money. You must have a son, and you must have something to keep him on. I think you'll have to hunt a long time before you find anyone so likely to provide all that's necessary as Gwendolen Durant." "I like her very much," allowed Lionel, somewhat uncertainly. "Then why don't you propose tonight? There's nothing like a dance for that sort of thing. The music and the flowers and the gaiety, it all attunes the mind to amorous affairs." "That's all very well, but she makes one rather nervous," laughed Lionel. "Fiddlesticks! Take her into the conservatory and play with her fan. That will lead you to take her hand. Then put your arm boldly round her waist, and the rest will follow of itself, or you're no son of mine." Lionel shrugged his shoulders and smiled without enthusiasm. "I see that Mrs. Fitzherbert is here," he said inconsequently. "Is she? I must go and find her. Take my advice, my boy. Propose to Gwendolen tonight, and perhaps I'll pay a bill or two for you in the morning." He waved his hand familiarly and disappeared in search of the handsome widow. He found her very comfortably seated in an armchair, looking at the dancers with tolerant disdain. She smiled in sympathy as she caught the happy eyes of a girl going round the room in an ecstasy of delight. She nodded with satisfaction when a handsome man passed by. She sought idly to get some notion of character as one physiognomy or another attracted her attention. But what most pleased her was the thought that she herself was merely a spectator. The delights of middle age were by no means to be despised. She was free to go where she would, sufficiently rich, indifferent to the opinion of her fellows. 20 years ago, she nearly broke her heart at a ball because she was obliged to sit out 5 dances running without a partner, but now her chief wish was that no one should interrupt her enjoyment of that varied scene. Yet when Canon Spratter approached, she rose to greet him with every appearance of cordiality. She wore all her diamonds and a gown whose handsome lines showed off the magnificence of her figure. He thought she had never seemed more stately. "May I have the pleasure of a dance?" he asked, smiling, but in the most formal way. Mrs. Fitzherbert opened her eyes wide and stared at him. "What on earth are you talking about?" "I don't know how I can express myself more plainly," he laughed. "My dear Canon, I haven't danced for 15 years. Come," he said gaily, "I never take a refusal. I know you dance divinely. Don't be so absurd. We should make ourselves perfectly ridiculous. People would roar with laughter and say, 'Look at those two old fogies doddering round together.' Nothing of the sort. They'd say, 'Look at Theodore Spratter. He's dancing with the belle of the evening. Isn't that like him?'" He put his arm round her waist, and notwithstanding a laughing remonstrance, bore her into the middle of the room. It was true that he danced well, and for 5 minutes Mrs. Fitzherbert forgot that she was hard upon 50. He talked the most charming nonsense. Her eyes began to flash as brightly as his, and she surrendered herself entirely to the pleasure of the waltz. It gave her a curious thrill to feel the strong hand that rested like a caress on her waist. Presently he led her into a little nook, all gay with roses, which had been arranged in an alcove on the stairs. "You detestable creature!" she cried, sinking into a chair. "I was congratulating myself on being out of the turmoil of life, and you've made me regret it so that I could almost burst into tears. But acknowledge that you enjoyed it, and you know just as well as I do that you were the most beautiful woman in the room." "How many virtuous matrons have you already assured of that fact tonight?" she asked with a laugh. "Ah, you think I'm joking, but I'm deadly serious," he answered. "Then there's no possible excuse for you. You can't subdue me so easily as that. Does it mean nothing to you that the band is playing the most sentimental tunes and that all these roses have turned the place into a garden? You see, I'm never so foolish as to forget that I'm long past 40. "I never think of your age," he answered, and for the life of her, she could not tell if he was in earnest. "To me, you are a lovely woman, kind and witty and delightful." She looked at him calmly. "What do you think Lionel would say if he heard you talk such rubbish?" "Lionel is wisely occupied with his own affairs. I've sent him to propose to Gwendolen Durant. He was shy, but I told him it was the simplest thing in the world. I told him to look at her fan." The canon opened his partners and smiled into her eyes, and that I told him would lead him naturally to take her hand. He audaciously seized Mrs. Fitzherbert's, but she, with a laugh, withdrew it. "I gather your meaning without your actually giving an example," she said. The canon's blue eyes sparkled with all the fire of youth. Another dance had begun, and they were left alone in their alcove. "Look here, why don't you marry me?" he asked suddenly. Mrs. Fitzherbert was taken completely aback. It had never dawned on her that his bantering speeches could tend to any such end. "My dear man, have you taken leave of your senses? My children are making their own homes, and I shall be left alone. Whatever you say, we're neither of us old yet. Why shouldn't we join forces?" "It's too absurd," she said, "that I should want to marry you. Look in your glass, dear friend, and it will tell you there are 100 good reasons." He put his arm round her, and before she realized what he was about, kissed her lips. "I thank you from the bottom of my heart." "But I haven't accepted," she cried. "I told you I never took a refusal. I shall inform Sophia that you've promised to marry me." Giving her no time to reply, he jumped up, pressed her hand lightly, and disappeared. Mrs. Fitzherbert did not know whether to be amused or angry. The affair seemed like a joke that had been carried too far, and she really could not believe that the canon meant what he said. Suddenly an idea struck her. A smile came to her lips and she began to laugh. The idea gained shape. She threw back her head and laughed till the tears positively ran down her cheeks. But the canon returned to the ballroom, feeling not a day more than 25. Winnie came up to him. "I'm ready to go home when you like, Papa. I'm rather tired." He looked at his watch. Nonsense. One's not tired at 2 in the morning at your age. Why, I feel as fit as a fiddle. Come. He seized her, and before she knew where she was, whirled her into the middle of the room. He would not let her expostulate, but danced as though he would never tire. His spirits were so high that he could have shouted at the top of his voice. When they were all three in the carriage on their way home, Canon Spratter turned to his son. "Well, did you take my advice?" he asked. "I didn't have a chance," said Lionel discontentedly. "Good Lord, you're not half the man your father is." The canon chuckled and rubbed his hands. He asked Winnie's permission to light a cigar and put up his feet comfortably on the opposite seat. "I've had a very charming evening. Upon my soul, it's wonderful what good it does a hard-working man to have a little innocent enjoyment.